The KGB was the most powerful intelligence organization in human history. At its peak, it employed hundreds of thousands of officers, ran networks of informants across every continent, and reached into the lives of nearly every Soviet citizen. It survived Stalin's purges, the Cold War, and decades of Western pressure. Then it destroyed itself through a sequence of decisions that each seemed defensible at the time, and collectively proved catastrophic. This is how an empire of secrets fell apart from the inside. Becoming the Tsar's private army, the KGB's first fatal error was not made in 1991. It was made in 1954, the moment it was created. The Secretary of State, Leon Trotsky, had said that the government needed a guardian of the guardians. The KGB was to be that guardian. But instead of being empowered, it became subservient. It became the tool of the ruling party. The KGB's organization was like that of any other bureaucratic operation. It had headquarters, regional offices, and field agents. But the key difference was that they were armed. They were equipped with weapons, intelligence technology, and political power. They were supposed to protect the country, but instead, they became the ones to protect from it. So the KGB served not the country, but the party. They were no longer an independent agency. They were a secret army of the party leaders.
Stalin's death left a power vacuum, and Nikita Khrushchev needed an intelligence service he could control rather than fear. The new KGB was placed under strict Communist Party supervision, deliberately weakened from its predecessor, and designed to serve the political leadership rather than the state. This seemed like a reasonable correction after decades of NKVD terror. The problem was that it permanently fused the KGB's identity to whoever held power in the Kremlin. The organization had no independent institutional loyalty to Russia itself, only to the party. When the party began to collapse in the late 1980s, the KGB had no framework for deciding what it actually stood for. It had spent 30 years being a tool rather than an institution, and tools do not survive when the hand holding them lets go. Trusting Aldrich Ames with everything. In 1985, the KGB recruited Aldrich Ames, a CIA counterintelligence officer, who would hand them the identities of virtually every Western asset operating inside the Soviet Union. The KGB acted on his intelligence almost immediately, arresting and executing agents across their networks. The operation seemed like an extraordinary success. What the KGB failed to account for was the catastrophic exposure this created. Burning that many assets simultaneously made it obvious to Western counterintelligence that someone significant had been compromised. The CIA began quietly hunting for the mole. More critically, the KGB's willingness to immediately liquidate everyone Ames identified meant they lost any possibility of running double agents or feeding disinformation back through those networks. They traded long-term strategic depth for short-term satisfaction. When Ames was finally caught in 1994, the damage assessment revealed that the KGB had essentially dismantled its own penetration of Western intelligence in exchange for one source they could not protect forever: Afghanistan and the intelligence failure they ignored. The KGB's Analytical Directorate produced assessments in 1978 warning that military intervention in Afghanistan would produce a prolonged insurgency the Soviet Union could not win cleanly. Those assessments were accurate. The political leadership in Moscow ignored them, invaded in December 1979, and the KGB found itself in the impossible position of having predicted a disaster it was now expected to help manage. KGB officers in Afghanistan spent the following decade trying to prop up a government that had no genuine popular support, while simultaneously reporting back to Moscow that the war was unwinnable. Moscow kept receiving those reports and kept escalating. The damage to the KGB was institutional. An intelligence service that consistently produces accurate analysis and is consistently ignored eventually stops producing honest analysis. Officers learn what leadership wants to hear. By the mid-1980s,
the KGB's internal culture had developed a systematic bias toward telling the Politburo what it wanted to know rather than what it needed to know. Afghanistan did not just drain Soviet resources, it corroded the KGB's core function.
Letting the surveillance state get too visible. The KGB maintained informant networks that, by some estimates, involved one informant for every 6 or 7 Soviet citizens. This seemed like comprehensive control. It was actually a structural catastrophe waiting to happen. When the system worked, nobody talked. When it began to crack under Gorbachev's reforms, everybody already knew exactly how it worked because they had all lived inside it. There was no mystique left, no uncertainty about methods or reach. Soviet citizens did not fear the KGB by the late 1980s the way earlier generations had, partly because the organization had become so embedded in daily life that it felt bureaucratic rather than terrifying. When the fear evaporated, the KGB discovered it had no other tool. It could surveil, it could report, it could not actually compel a population that had stopped believing the consequences were real. The surveillance state had become so normalized that it lost the psychological power that made surveillance states function. The decision to back Gorbachev's reforms. KGB Chairman Vladimir Khrushchev initially supported Mikhail Gorbachev's Glasnost and Perestroika programs in the mid-1980s. This seemed rational. The Soviet economy was visibly failing. The Afghanistan war was bleeding the country, and some form of reform appeared necessary for the system to survive. What the KGB failed to model was the speed at which controlled openness becomes uncontrollable openness. Intelligence services are built on the assumption that information can be managed. Glasnost was a systematic dismantling of that assumption. Once Soviet citizens could access honest journalism, once the crimes of the Stalin era became publicly discussable, once Eastern European satellite states began slipping away without Soviet tanks rolling in to stop them, the KGB found itself defending an ideology that its own leadership had publicly admitted was built on lies. There is no intelligence operation that survives its own government confessing to its foundational deceptions, failing to stop the nationalist movements. Through the 1980s, the KGB watched nationalist movements grow in the Baltic states, Ukraine, Georgia, and across the Soviet periphery. They filed reports, they monitored leaders, they compiled dossiers. What they did not do was develop any coherent strategy for addressing the underlying conditions producing those movements. The assumption was that surveillance and occasional targeted repression would be sufficient, the same tools that had worked in 1956 and 1968. By 1989, those tools required a willingness to use mass violence that Gorbachev would not authorize and that the international environment would not absorb without catastrophic consequences. The KGB had spent decades treating political dissatisfaction as a security problem to be suppressed rather than a political problem to be addressed. When suppression was taken off the table, they had nothing left in the toolkit. The August coup. In August 1991, Khrushchev led a group of hardliners in a coup attempt against Gorbachev, placing him under house arrest in Crimea and announcing a state of emergency. The coup plotters controlled the KGB, significant military units, and the formal apparatus of Soviet state power. They believed this was enough. It was not. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament building, and crowds gathered to defend it. The coup collapsed within 3 days. The plotters had made a catastrophic miscalculation, rooted in decades of KGB thinking. They assumed that controlling institutions meant controlling outcomes. They had spent so long monitoring public opinion, rather than understanding it, that they genuinely did not know the Soviet population would not simply comply. The KGB's own intelligence about the mood of Soviet society had been so distorted by decades of telling leadership what it wanted to hear that its leaders walked into a coup attempt without understanding they had already lost. The aftermath they never planned for. When the coup failed, Gorbachev suspended the Communist Party.
The KGB was immediately exposed as having orchestrated an illegal seizure of power. Kryuchkov was arrested. The organization that had survived every Soviet leader since its founding had just destroyed its own political protection in 72 hours. There was no contingency plan because the KGB had never seriously planned for failure. Intelligence services plan for adversaries. They rarely plan for the collapse of their own legitimacy. Within months, the KGB was formally dissolved, broken into successor agencies that spent the following decade fighting over resources, personnel, and relevance. The surveillance files, the foreign networks, the institutional knowledge built over 40 years, all of it was fragmented and partially destroyed in the chaos.
An organization that had penetrated the Manhattan Project, run agents inside British intelligence, and maintained global reach across 6 continents could not survive 3 days of its own bad judgment on the streets of Moscow. The KGB's collapse was not caused by Western pressure, though that pressure was real. It was not caused by a single catastrophic intelligence failure, though there were many. It collapsed because every structural decision it had made across 4 decades optimized for control rather than competence, for loyalty rather than accuracy, and for political survival rather than institutional integrity. By 1991, it was an organization that knew everything about its enemies and almost nothing true about itself. The most powerful intelligence service in history was ultimately undone by the one thing it had never learned to do: tell the truth to the people in the room.